I read a quote yesterday that really resonated with me, and it went something like this. There are two views of the Israeli military. On the one hand, it's what you see in the media. On the other side, there's the truth. Now, I hardly need to paint a picture for you of what the media says about the IDF. It is allegations of genocide and indiscriminate killing and targeting civilians and killing babies. The list goes on and on and on. And then, on the other hand, there is the truth. And today, with us, to unpack that truth for us, to walk through the facts with us, is the man responsible for that quote. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Colonel Richard Kemp, the commander of the Order of the British Empire. Now, Richard joined the British Army the day after he left school, and then he spent the next 30 years in some of the world's most notorious conflict hotspots, commanding British troops in, among others, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He also served as the commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Richard has dedicated his life to fighting terrorism and insurgency. From 2002 to 2006, he headed the International Terrorism Intelligence Team at the British Prime Minister's office. He also chaired the Strategic Intelligence Group at COBRA, the UK National Crisis Management Committee. And for all his trouble, Richard's name was discovered on an Al-Qaeda hit list in Syria in 2013. And these days, Richard is a writer, he's a prolific journalist, media commentator, a motivational speaker, and a strategic consultant. He's been present during each conflict between Israel and Hamas since 2008, and he's been in Israel since the beginning of the current Gaza war. Richard, welcome. Now, Richard, your relationship with Israel, where did that start? How did you come to be Israel's ambassador, one of Israel's ambassadors?
Well, I wouldn't describe myself quite as that, but I was in the British Army for 30 years, and in the latter years of that, I worked for the UK Prime Minister's office, the Cabinet Office, and I was dealing with international terrorism intelligence. And in that this was just after 9/11, and in that capacity, I worked very closely with a number of international intelligence agencies, including FBI, CIA, German, French intelligence, etc., and of course, very significantly, Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military intelligence services as well. So, these were the experts on international terrorism above all, I think, in the world at the time. And we gained a huge amount of benefit from working with the Israelis, not just in the intelligence world, but in various other areas as well. And Israeli intelligence and Israeli technology, Israeli know-how saved the lives of many British soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and of British civilians in London and elsewhere in the UK, etc. And it was very striking, the cooperation that we were given at a time, as I say, in the years following 9/11, when we were actually struggling quite a lot to get our heads around the Islamist terrorist threat, and Israel helped us immensely. So really that was the beginnings, I think, of my involvement with Israel, which has continued to this day.
So basically a friendship based on respect, mutual respect?
Yeah, mutual respect, mutual cooperation, I think, as well. And in my case, the understanding that Britain and Israel and the US and other countries in the world today are fighting the same enemy. Israel's right at the front line of that fight, but we're fighting the same enemy, we're fighting the same ideology, and we're all under threat from it. And we should all be on the same side, we should all be helping each other. And that's a major reason. And another reason that I see that it's important to, shall we say, to stand alongside Israel, is because when I was a child, I was taught right from wrong. And I recognise right when I see it, and I recognise wrong when I see it. And I was also taught that if I have a ability to intervene on the side of right, it's my duty to do so. In this case, I do have that ability, and I know that Israel in this case is in the right, and Israel's enemies are very, very firmly in the wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is not an Israeli problem. This is not something that Israel alone should face.
This is a global problem. And you know, our country, Britain, and of course the US and other countries are assisting Israel in this war, strongly assisting Israel in this war, and it's right they should do so. They're not sending forces to fight alongside Israel, and I don't think that's necessary either, or desirable actually. I think it's important Israel is seen as a strong country, standing on its own feet, destroying the enemies that threaten it. But I think, you know, there are various other ways in which we can and should be helping Israel. And for example, when you look at the threat from the Houthis in the Red Sea against international shipping, that threat is, to an extent at least, is focused on Israel. So we are, Britain, America, other countries are involved in fighting that particular front on Israel's war.
Richard, I do want to speak to you about the IDF and more specifically the IDF's conduct in Gaza at the moment. However, before we get to that, let's speak about conflict in general, because you've been in multitude of conflicts. You have served on the front lines all over the world, but so many of us haven't. I have no experience, so very often in my mind it is quite a clinical thing with two armies facing each other on a predetermined battlefield. Can you tell us what it's really like, and specifically what it's like for civilians?
Yeah, every conflict is extremely chaotic. There's confusion, there's disarray, things that you plan never go the way you expect them to or hope they will. And being able to master that situation is the key to winning, apart from, of course, having a superior military capability. But being able to master chaos is the key to winning. I was in, before I came here to Israel in October, I was in Ukraine a few times, and I spent some time on the front line there, and I was observing the Russian and the Ukrainian conflict. And although that's much more intense than this conflict in terms of the casualty rates, in terms of the things like artillery, tanks, aircraft, which both sides have, it's also, I would say, in a strange way, it's an easier conflict to fight because you have two uniformed armies fighting each other, identifiable as such on the whole, not always. This conflict here in Gaza is much more similar to the kind of wars we fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and other places, Northern Ireland even in the case of the UK, where you have the enemy, Israel's enemy, is blended in among the civilian population. They don't wear uniform. They often move without weapons so that you can't identify them as a terrorist even by that. You're faced with a very, very difficult situation when you're trying to kill these people who are among the civilian population. And that's not all. This battlefield in Gaza is probably the most treacherous and complex, difficult battlefield to fight on that any army's ever fought on, because Hamas had decades to prepare this battlefield for when Israel did carry out an attack, which was always going to be an inevitability, given what Hamas was trying to do to Israel. And of course, you know, with the booby traps, landmines, prepared, pre-planned sniper positions, ambush positions, places to get away, all these sort of things. Then on top of that, you add the complexity of the tunnel network underneath Gaza. There's hundreds of kilometers of tunnels prepared over decades with huge amounts of resources. Very tough environment to deal with. The terrorists operate mainly from the tunnels inside Gaza. I've been into these tunnels underneath Gaza, and I've seen how extremely well prepared they are. They're basically concrete structures on the whole, concrete floors, concrete walls, concrete ceilings. They have, in almost every single one, if not every tunnel, has multiple booby traps in them. They have sniper positions within. They have even blast walls and heavy blast doors, so the tunnels can be compartmentalized to make it even more difficult to fight inside them. And I don't think any army has ever had to fight in such a complex and extensive tunnel network as this is. Then you've got the civilian population, and the civilian population is being used deliberately by Hamas as a weapon against Israel. Hamas's tactics are to try and force Israel to kill as many of their as many Gazan civilians as possible. This is a unique situation, I think. I haven't come across another enemy that has deliberately wanted its enemy to kill its own civilian population. And the reason for that, of course, is to encourage delegitimization of Israel, hatred of Israel, to isolation of Israel around the world, because Israel is killing innocent civilians, and Israel unavoidably is killing innocent civilians, but the problem is made more difficult because Hamas wants that to happen. It's a real unique and terrible problem. And it works every time, because every time Israel gets involved in a conflict with Gaza, with Hamas in Gaza or other terrorists in Gaza, the world condemns Israel. Whatever Israel does, it's wrong. The world condemns it. So that's another complex. Then you've got the hostages, many hostages inside Gaza. I don't know of any army that's had to fight in this sort of environment, and an urban environment is notoriously difficult to fight in. I don't know of any other army that's had to fight with hostages in this situation, which have to be, of course, very much taken into account by the Israeli Defense Force. And there's many other complexities. The final major one of stress is the intense spotlight on what's going on in Gaza from the world, the media, from international organisations, human rights groups, the UN, the EU, governments, etc., which of course make it even more complicated to fight because of the scrutiny that Israel's under.
So basically, the IDF is writing the textbook as they go along. There's no prerequisite for it. This is the first time it's happening.
There are many commonalities between this conflict and things like Afghanistan and Iraq, but you're right, it's absolutely unique. This is a one-off situation, I think, and that's recognised because armies from around the world, they have representatives here in Israel now, or have been in Israel, for the specific purpose of studying what the IDF is doing. Because one of the complexities and the challenges that things like drone strikes, which have been used extensively in Ukraine, but are a relatively new feature of modern warfare, how the IDF deal with that. And it's not just because of these challenges, it's also because of the way the IDF is fighting it. And the IDF has been phenomenally successful so far in this war. And armies, British Army, US Army, other armies around the world will want to be learning lessons from Israel's success in this challenging situation.
Now, Richard, you have been quoted as saying that in your experience and observation, the IDF does more than any army in modern history to preserve the life of civilians. You've said that Israel is the most moral army in the world. Can you explain for us how does that look in practice? What does it look like practically?
Well, I think it's true to say that the IDF go further than any other army that I know of, and I know of pretty much all the armies, in trying to maximize the destruction of its enemy, Hamas, while trying to minimize the deaths, destruction and harm to the civilian population. And it puts phenomenal resources into that. First of all, it educates soldiers from the very first day they join the IDF about their responsibilities under the laws of armed conflict to treat civilians with respect, to treat them well, and not to deliberately target them. And while that may sound an obvious thing, and our armies do the same, British, American, other armies do the same thing, but the IDF, I think, put even more emphasis on it. And since I've been here, I've questioned IDF soldiers from the top level down to the bottom level about their understanding of their responsibilities under the laws of war. And to me, it's very clear they understand it extremely well because they've been indoctrinated with it since the word go. So that's the first thing. Then every commander in the IDF and every soldier practices what the law requires. In other words, they, for example, when there's an attack taking place among the civilian population, which is most of it in Gaza, they discriminate between civilians and military. They make a distinction. They do everything they can, and it's hard because, as I say, the combatants move without weapons, often in civilian clothes. When they're above ground, they know that pretty much every house in Gaza has weapons in it. Not every single house necessarily, but most houses have weapons in it. So when they go to a house, they can move around the streets from house to house, unarmed, therefore not necessarily a legitimate target, unless they can be identified in some other way as a terrorist, and then go to a house, pick up a rocket launcher, get some grenades, get some weapons, and attack the IDF with them. That's, again, it's an unusual way of operating, but it's the way they've been operating here. And careful distinction between the two. Warning, again, the laws of war require that the IDF warn the civilian population to leave an area, and if they can, get them to leave an area. That's more difficult, but they can certainly warn them, and they do. And warnings consist of things like text messages, voice messages, phone calls, leaflets being dropped, showing where an area is going to be attacked, where the safer area might be, and how to get there on a map. And this is done, millions of these leaflets have been dropped, hundreds of thousands of phone calls and text messages, etc., have been made. And every effort to get these people out has been done. And at the same time, when they're carrying out a deliberate attack, let's say against a building which they know contains terrorist or terrorist infrastructure, not only will they warn the civilians to go, they'll also monitor the ground from surveillance platforms, which will show them when the civilian population has left. And when that's happened, they will then strike. Sometimes, of course, accidents occur. Sometimes, for example, a building is hit with a specific type of munition designed to kill that to destroy that building and the people in it, but not necessarily cause wider harm. But if there's an explosive cache, Hamas explosive cache, in the building, it can cause more extensive damage. Sometimes a building will completely collapse. A tunnel underneath it will collapse as well, causing other collateral damage. So it's not a perfect system, but then war can't be perfect. And while all this is going on, Hamas very often is trying to stop the civilians from leaving the area. So Hamas, the IDF is doing all it can to prevent civilian damage and to comply with the laws of war. Hamas is doing the opposite. Not only are they firing rockets deliberately at civilian population in Israel, not only are they using their own civilian population to attack from, which is also illegal under the laws of war, they're also preventing civilians from leaving that area, which is, again, a war crime. So there's essentially 3 war crimes in almost every attack that Hamas and the other terrorists in Gaza carry out. In addition to all of this, and there are many other measures the IDF take, but in addition to all of this, you have the IDF have a very, very well developed intelligence system in Gaza, not in Gaza, but supporting the troops fighting in Gaza. I think a unique intelligence system which gives, which has specific large teams back inside Israel of intelligence staff dedicated to providing up-to-date, immediate intelligence on the threats to the IDF troops on the ground in a way that I've never seen done before. But in addition to that, apart from the key tasks of destroying Hamas and trying to rescue the hostages, these intelligence teams are focused also on minimizing civilian harm. In Southern Command of the IDF, which is commanding this fight, is a thing called the Civilian Harm Mitigation Unit, which exists, again, I've not seen anything like this before, exists solely to provide information on what's going on the battlefield to the commanders to make sure they minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. So these are all, and I think the in a way the proof of the effectiveness that the Israel Defense Force is having is shown by the casualty ratios. It's a terrible thing to reduce human life to statistics, but in a world where Israel is condemned, vilified on the basis of lying propaganda, which says that the IDF is deliberately trying to kill innocent civilians or is being indiscriminate is not obeying the laws of war. I think it's necessary to use this sort of data to basically disprove that argument. And if you take the casualty ratios, the civilian to military casualty ratios, working on the figures that the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry has produced, which we can't rely on, but we don't have anything else. So let's assume for a moment they're roughly correct. Plus the IDF's assessment of the number of terrorists they've killed in Gaza since the ground war began. You have a ratio of approximately 1.3 or 1.5 civilians for every terrorist that's killed. And that does sound bad. It sounds as it should be the other way around at worst. But actually, if you compare that to other casualty ratios, the United Nations put out a report a few years back saying that in urban conflict, since the Second World War, around the world, the average casualty ratio have been 9 civilians killed for every 1 combatant, 9 to 1. That is disputed, that ratio, but that's what the UN said at one point. What we do know more accurately, perhaps, is that in Afghanistan and Iraq, the estimates are that the US and its allies, including the UK, inflicted approximately 3 to 5 civilian casualties for every 1 combatant. So if you compare the two, 3 to 5 to 1 and 1.3 approximately to 1, you can see that Israel is succeeding in a much more demanding environment, for the reasons I've already discussed, in minimizing the deaths of innocent civilians.
My goodness, Richard. So you have Hamas on the one side, basically pushing their civilians into harm's way, Israel trying its level best not to hit them and to get at Hamas behind those civilians. And all the while, the world is going...
Yeah, the world is upside down in this respect in particular. And you know, I was over here a few years ago with a group of generals, retired generals from around the world, from many countries in the world. And we were studying a previous conflict here in Gaza, which also involved land operations. And one of the conclusions of this group of generals was they expressed their concern in the report that we wrote, which was that their own armies, British, American, Canadian, Australian, Indian, numerous other armies around the world, German, French, would not be able to achieve the same success at minimizing civilian casualties as the IDF had done. They felt the IDF had set, in a way, too high a bar in this area of warfare.
Now, if we have this situation where the IDF is doing a stellar job, a much better job than has been done in history, where do you get the accusations that this has been the worst killing of civilians? This has been the worst civilian death rate in history.
Well, this is part of a decades-long anti-Israel propaganda campaign. And that propaganda campaign says that Israel is an illegitimate country, Israel stole Arab land, Israel are illegal occupiers, Israel are illegal settlers, Israel's an apartheid state, and now, it's been said before, but particularly now, Israel is carrying out a genocide. And this is a narrative that has really started in the 1960s, and it actually began in Moscow. The whole anti-Israel narrative began with the KGB in Moscow, in cahoots with Egypt, and tried to turn what was a religious conflict, in other words, the Arab, the Muslims, determination that no country apart from no entity apart from an Islamic entity could control this territory. So a religious war. And the Soviet Union tried to turn that from being a religious war into being a war of national liberation, as they did in many other places. And that's where it began. And many of the themes you hear, many of the river to the sea stuff, the apartheid, all of that began in Moscow. And so people who are parroting that now, they're parroting Soviet Union propaganda. But it's taken hold, and it's commonly believed, I think, in many many countries in the world outside the Middle East, probably more so outside the Middle East than in the Middle East. And so, for example, on the 7th of October, most people agree what happened was barbaric, horrific, dreadful, but Israel had it coming because of all those things that I mentioned, all of which are lies, Israel deserved it. Israel asked for it. And even the UN Secretary General has said something like that. And anything Israel does in response is wrong because Israel is illegitimate. It cannot really, it's not allowed to defend itself against this kind of aggression. So that's why you have these lies. It's an inevitability. And people actually, because most people don't know anything about it or understand it, most people believe it.
The production of this investigative series is made possible by the generous donations of Christians from around the world. You can also make a difference by supporting this initiative. We want you to share, to give, and be a voice so that we can produce more series like this. The truth about what is happening here in Israel and around the world must be told, and it must go out. Please click on the link to donate.
Not only that, a phenomenon that I see is that even if Israel was right in retaliating, surely this has been enough. Yes, October 7th was horrible. Yes, Israel had every right to defend itself. But isn't this enough? Has the retribution and the payback not been enough? Yet this isn't retribution. This isn't payback. What is this?
Well, this is Israel defending itself against a genocidal terrorist threat. Israel is accused of genocide. I mean, the South African accusations against Israel of genocide are an obscenity. What you've got is a Western democratic country observing international law, fighting against a genocidal terrorist entity. Hamas's genocidal nature is expressed in its charter clearly. It's made clear repeatedly by its leaders that they intend to annihilate the Jewish state. And not only that, but you go beyond that and kill Jews elsewhere in the world. And it's confirmed by its actions on the 7th of October. If those weren't genocidal actions, going into communities and just butchering everyone they could find, I don't know what is. And there's a big difference between what Israel's doing, which is trying to target terrorists, and unfortunately in a situation where civilians have to die, and deliberately going into a community and butchering everybody. So that's the reality of what Israel's doing. It's fighting a genocidal terrorist organization which wants to destroy it. It's not about vengeance, it's not about retribution, it's about self-defense. Every country, any country in the world that was subject to that kind of depredation would respond as very closely to what Israel's doing. They have no choice. And if you look at the Second World War, something like, I think 3 million German civilians were killed in the Second World War, German civilians. Was that too much? It was necessary, unfortunately, it was necessary in order to destroy the Nazi regime, which was also intent on genocide and conquest. So, I would love it if this war ended now and if there were no more civilian deaths. Every civilian death in conflict is absolutely abhorrent, but the nature of conflict is such that it's an unfortunate adjunct, I suppose, to the need to defend the country.
So, what I see is this. Israel is one of the most moral armies in the world. No one knows that except for Israel's enemy. And they exploit that.
Yeah. Hamas, people say Hamas ignore the laws of war. Hamas don't ignore the laws of war. Hamas know the laws of war extremely well. They don't in any circumstances apply them to themselves, but as you say, they exploit Israel's adherence to the laws of war, and they exploit the world's expectation that the laws of war will be applied. And they do everything they can to manipulate the picture that the world gets to show Israel is not adhering to the laws of war. And it goes beyond even lies and fake propaganda, and for example turning an attack that there was an attack early in the war against the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza, which the Hamas accused Israel of perpetrating, the media jumped straight on that bandwagon. The BBC and other international media were pointing the finger directly at Israel and accusing Israel of killing something like 500 people in the hospital. It turned out it was I think an Islamic Jihad rocket which fell short and it may have killed a handful of people. I don't know how many, but it certainly wasn't anything like 500. So that sort of distortions are a part of it. But they go beyond that. There's a phenomenon called Pallywood, in which the Hamas terrorists and other extremist groups make movies. They fake movies. They show that Hamas have killed innocent civilians in Gaza, and it's just fake. It's just made up. And very often, because so much of the media is very keen to blacken Israel's name, they will take these movies and they'll use them as if they're fact. Whether they know that they're not, I would hope they don't know that. I hope they're just taken in by it. They're gullible rather than complicit. But that's the kind of extremes that Hamas and other extremists will go to.
Now, we've spoken about the morality of the IDF, but where does that come from? Why the morality in the IDF? Why these high values? Why these high standards?
The morality of the IDF in war is comparable to the morality of British, American, and other Western armies that fight in conflict. They adhere to the laws of war. The laws of war have pretty stringent requirements, primarily when it comes to fighting an enemy among a civilian population and dealing with things like prisoners of war or wounded enemy troops. But it's pretty clear, stringent rules that are adhered to by all of our forces. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. In every army there are bad soldiers. There are, in the circumstances of combat, people make mistakes as well. If you think about it, they're human beings. They're in grave danger themselves. They may have just seen their mates killed beside them. There's chaos, confusion, smoke, flames, explosions. They may be very tired. They may be very hungry. Numerous things that cause soldiers to make mistakes. So there are mistakes made. The IDF make them, we make them, etc. And you can see that also played out in some of the situations like friendly fire, blue on blue fratricide, whatever you want to call it, where members of an army will kill their own soldiers accidentally, and that happens here. It happens everywhere in every war. So I think the IDF is strongly adheres to the laws of war, but it also comes. I think that the need for it goes outside the laws of war as well, and I think it's explained by Judaism, and although I think I'm right in saying that most Israelis are not practicing Jews, Judaism still has a very, very strong influence over all elements of society in Israel, including the IDF. Whereas, for example, in Britain, Christianity used to be a very strong influence on everything as well. It's much less so now. There are Christianity is not dying, but it's not as strong as it ought to be. Whereas I think the virtues of Judaism, which is very similar to virtues of Christianity, are still strong, and that helps. And the other thing that I think contributes to the morality of the IDF is the fact that the soldiers are conscripts. In most other armies around the world, certainly the British, the American, other armies, everyone that's serving is a volunteer. They want to serve. They want to be soldiers, and that I think brings to the game a bit of maybe a greater level of aggression. And if you are in the IDF, the majority of soldiers are not there because they want to be soldiers. They don't want to get into battle. They have to because their country is under great threat and they have no option other than to serve in the forces. So they're people that want to be bricklayers, or they want to be computer experts, financiers, property. They want to work in a factory, whatever it is they want to do. That's what they want to do. They don't want to be soldiers. And I think that kind of adds to the strength of morality in the IDF.
So, Richard, my last question. I go back to the quote that I opened with, saying there are two primary ways in which to look at the IDF. The one portrayed in the media and the truth. How do you see this playing out? That the truth is ever going to come out, or is this going to continue to happen into the future? How do you see this playing out? How do you see this war playing out in public opinion?
Well, firstly, I go back to what I said before about this incredibly strong anti-Israel narrative that has taken hold of so much of the world, particularly among younger people. And I see it very hard. I see it as being very hard to loosen that. And when you add something we haven't spoken about, is Iran's role behind all this, which is extremely strong. Iran is behind Hamas, it's behind Islamic Jihad, it's behind Lebanese Hezbollah, it's behind so many other proxies in the region. And Iran is dedicated to the destruction of Israel and contributes to this narrative that permeates around the world. So I think it's very hard. It's very, very hard to shake that. And I'm pessimistic. I'm sorry to end on a note of pessimism. I'm pessimistic that this will change. And very often the truth doesn't matter. If you've got people who are dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel, or are inherently anti-Semitic, or both, the truth doesn't really matter to them. It's the narrative that's important. And so you can, all the things we've talked about, which everything I've said is the truth. So what? Doesn't matter. Israel is still in the wrong. Israel still deserves to be annihilated, and they can't defend themselves. And I think after each conflict, we've seen this is a pattern that's been repeated. In this case, it's far more intense because this is the longest conflict Israel's fought since the War of Independence in 1948-49. And therefore the kind of head of steam has grown. But in previous conflicts, every previous conflict, we've seen Israel condemned, we've seen Israel accused of war crimes. We've then learned more of the truth after the conflict's finished, when things can be properly analysed. And it turns out that actually the figures that Hamas gave were not right, and the figures that the IDF gave were right. And it comes to light, but it doesn't change it, because it then repeats itself again and again and again. And I've spoken at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva numerous times in emergency debates following Israeli conflicts. And every time Israel is condemned, it works. This works for the enemies of Israel, and it will be repeated. But having said all that, I do believe that it's still, even though it may be a losing battle, it's still a battle that should be fought. But I think those of us who understand the reality and want to see right happen, we should be willing to stick up for Israel, to stand up for Israel, irrespective of what anyone else is saying. I get attacked all the time. I'm constantly attacked, whether it's on social media, whether it's at speeches I'm giving, or whatever, in the media, in the mainstream media itself. I'm constantly under attack. I don't care about that. And I'm in a slightly different position to the average Jewish person who's trying to stick up for Israel, because it's part of their life. Whereas for me, it's an important part of my life, but it's just one part of it. But I see it as, and I would encourage certainly any Jewish or Christian or any other people who are watching our discussion, I would certainly encourage them to research this, to understand it, not to listen to the barrage that they're faced with, and then to put your head above the parapet. I know it's sometimes tough, but I think it's necessary to do it. And I don't see, I've been talking about being attacked. I don't mind that, but I don't see it either as being sticking up for Israel in this circumstance. I don't see it as being a burden. I see it in some ways as being an honour to be able to do that, because I know Israel's in the right, and I know Israel's enemies are in the wrong. And I think, in future years, I hope to be able to look back and say, at least I did what I could to support the right. And I would hope your viewers take the same approach.
Richard, you mentioned that this might be a pessimistic view. However, I don't really think so. I think it's more realistic. We face the odds. We know what we're facing. Israel is fighting a winning battle on the ground. The battle for public opinion might not be going that well. However, here you are, standing for right. Here I am, and here you are, standing up for what is right, for what is good. Israel, you are not alone. We are right here with you. Richard, thank you very, very much. Colonel Richard Kemp.
My pleasure, thank you.